Welcome to episode 96 of the Hard Truth About B2B E-commerce. I'm back with Tim for our first, I guess we can call it a duet cast. I know they call it solo cast on the Build a Better Agency podcast, but it's just going to be me and Tim today. So,
well, I'm excited about it. We don't do this often enough. I mean, we've talked about this before, but we love our guests. That is the core of what we do. But, we're also bouncing off a lot of different, clients and business situations and just things that are going on in the world that we talk about offline. So we might as well bring it in here to the podcast and bring it out to our listeners. I think that's a great idea. So, hey, everybody, it's great to have you.
So I just want to point out our highest traffic episode is our first episode.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of makes sense, just because it's had the most time, and it was it was just us.
So let me pause for a second to make sure that we get our sponsor mentions in, and then I just have one other thing to add after that. So let me pause for a moment. Balance is a B2B e-commerce payment solution that works well for you and for your buyers. It offers a seamless one-click checkout for almost any payment method, including ACH, wire, checks, cards, even terms. It's used by leaders in B2B e-commerce, and it's as easy as buying a shirt from Amazon. Check them out at getbalance.com. Book a session and tell them what your needs are. They are the first dedicated payment platform for B2B e-commerce, 100% tailored to your needs. Thanks again to our sponsor, Balance. And I hope that you do, use our sponsors, check them out. We really appreciate all their support. We have a tradition of shout outs. I always am talking to people, we're always chatting with folks who are listening to our podcast and getting something out of it. But something special this week happened. We got added to the top of the list of the B2B E-commerce Association of Australia of a podcast, B2B podcasts to listen to that are musts. And I want to give a big thanks to those folks. Really appreciate the mention. I heard a lot from folks on LinkedIn yesterday about it. Isaiah, I'm sure you did as well.
Yeah, they've been. I mean, it's all Brett, right? It's Brett.
Brett Sinclair,
yeah,
is that right?
Yeah, I got to give him a shout out. He's been really invested in building this B2B e-commerce community worldwide. I know he started in Australia, but he's trying to build this kind of like worldwide B2B e-commerce community, and I know he's really worked hard on it. So definitely appreciate Brett and him. Kind of like it kind of feeds itself, right? It's still kind of this, I would say, underdeveloped community and ecosystem. So he seems to be one of the main driving people. With I know he's got a little bit of a financial driver, but a lot of it I feel like he's doing it for the community, right? And so
I really think it's genuine. You're right. I mean, of course, we're all in business too, but I have to say, I feel like it's a genuine community, and he's a genuine community builder, if I could only say that right. And the other things I would say too is that I got some comments on this yesterday, and one of the best ones was somebody saying that they wanted to thank us for being pioneers. And isn't that great, right? I mean, we have been doing this a long time. We really love our guests and love that we've gotten out into the world, but thank you for that. That's really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm not going to introduce the guests because I'm so used to that. I was just trying to check to see, I'm looking at my other screen here. I think we've only done 2 or 3 with just us, but I think, we're going to try and do more because, it's not always easy to get guests that are kind of confident speaking about B2B e-commerce. Because
that's true.
A lot of people are confident speaking about B2C, but when you start talking about B2B, it's kind of a whole different ballgame. But what really inspired me was definitely just the Build a Better Agency podcast. I think he's on almost episode, I just checked, he's almost on episode 400. So we got some catching up to do, but he does a good job of filling in the gaps with himself, and so we have the advantage of talking to each other,
It's funny how many episodes some podcasts have. I mean, good for him. That's really endurance. I was a guest on a podcast for the love of sports. I think I was on episode 483 or something like that. Incredible, right?
Yeah, that's unbelievable. Well, I think a common theme that has come up is, this concept of culture and digital transformation. So I kind of wanted to get, your thoughts to start out. Like you've been brought into many companies to help them with culture and digital transformation and teams. And, where do you feel like that is at now, or as opposed to maybe where it was 5 years ago? Is it getting better? I assume it's getting a little better.
It is. So I'll throw this out there for our listeners to make sure that they have the picture. So, I was a retail guy years ago. I was an e-commerce guy. I was a marketing guy, for brands, for a lot of companies. Then I worked in the agency world. I consulted. One of the things I really focus on now, and I think largely because there's such a need, is I focus on transformation projects. And what does that mean? I mean, for a brand new business, of course, they're not transforming, they're trying to figure out how to make their mark in the world and how to get that revenue in and have their product or service out there. But for transformation, the core thing that it means is that, a business has existed in one form or another for a while, and they invested in, whatever products and technologies and resources and teams and, all of these things that a business invests in. But the transformation becomes necessary because the tech is often moving faster than they are, right? There's always something happening out in the world. So the classic example, just to make sure everybody gets this in their head, the classic example is when e-commerce started, right? When it actually became a thing in B2C, and now it's such a thing, for B2B, that took a lot of people kind of by surprise, because they were making millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars without it. And then all of a sudden it becomes this thing that their customers really want them to do, and it's an opportunity. So you have to figure out, how do you get from where you are, to where you're going, right? That's the whole transformation.
I think part of the problem is that companies don't know how to make these bets. And I call it bets. Like one of the things that I really kind of like pride myself in and what we've done at Trellis. And sometimes I even get in internal battles with the developers, because it does take a bit of like, not just development knowledge, but also like business. There's many factors, right? So I think that one of the reasons companies can't keep up is that tech's changing so fast, but you have to make some bets on some technologies, right? Like, I think it doesn't make sense to build things from scratch. And that's actually one of the arguments we're getting in internally. And I'm gonna have to meet with our developers to, have a conversation that I think will likely lead to them, adopting a universal kind of open source, tool that I think is a better model than some of the things we've been doing. Some things a little too bespoke, in my opinion. And I think the reason that companies can't stay on top of things is like, they don't know what to bet on or what to buy or what to build. And so, they buy the wrong things that then become obsolete, or they build things when they should have bought things, or they buy things when they should have built something. And so I think you kind of need a mix of the build and buy mentality. Just for people that don't understand, I think we should explain that. It's like buy versus build in technology. It's like you can buy a software, right? You can, I would include open source kind of in that. You can kind of like take an open source thing and use it, or buy something in a software, or you could build something from scratch, right? And even building from scratch usually is building on top of something open source these days. Like when you build, it's usually on React or something that's kind of like starting point, right? But I think just most companies have no idea where to start there. Or what they did is they bought an ERP 20 years ago, and they bought various software, but they really aren't that savvy at going out at the market, evaluating the options, and kind of like looking at the various factors to place a bet on that company. Because you're really placing a bet on that company, that like, is this going to be the right company I'm buying their software for the next 5-10 years, right? Because you don't want to buy something that becomes obsolete in 2 years, or there's a better competitor in 2 years, and now you have to transition again. It gets really expensive when you have to transition all these software, right?
Well,
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm going to answer the question that you asked at first. I want to make sure I gave that setup, but let me answer this because it ties in with what you're saying. What's different, let's say in the last 5 years, like pre-COVID, a couple of years before COVID versus today? Well, I think a lot of customers, clients, however you want to look at it, these companies I was working with were more in shock, or had to have these big team meetings and say, wait a minute, we need to invest X, and how do we do that in 18 months or whatever, right? It was more of a, I'm going to use the word crisis, but loosely, like it was a bigger deal for a lot of people. I think today, there's the recognition that there's a lot going on, right? You were always hearing things about AI. We heard a lot about the metaverse. There's always crypto and NFTs, all these things that are floating around in the world that we have to think about in some way. The difference today is that a lot of clients that I work with, they already have some sort of an innovation process, or let's say an innovation team, meaning that they meet regularly and they say, what are things that we need to consider? Or they'll budget, like a marketing team I was talking with recently at a B2B company. They have in their marketing budget, I think it's around 10%, where it's not really designated. They try to keep that money loose so that if a new platform pops up, or something completely different pops up, they could say, okay, maybe this is the time we invest that money, right? And I think that is a real big difference from maybe 5 years ago, when very, very few people did that or had the luxury of doing it.
But there's, I think, some danger in that, where also some of these companies, they have these little funds and people go out and they kind of buy the new shiny objects. There's two problems. One, they buy the random new shiny object that maybe looks cool. It isn't really the right tech with other things they could buy, or they don't factor. I think a lot of people don't factor in the services, right? Because buying a technology is only as good as what you do with it, right? And I just talked to one of our larger, more sophisticated clients, and they brought in a new, pretty high level tech guy. And he's like, yeah, when I came in, all they had done is just set up the software, but they weren't really doing much with all these enterprise software. And I see that a lot with not just small companies, but large companies too, where they buy, Salesforce or Salesforce Marketing Cloud, or, Adobe Marketing Cloud. And it's like, okay, so what are you actually doing with it? Well, we can barely afford to staff someone to run it. And then they need an agency because they can't do everything themselves. And they didn't budget for the service. A lot of times the services to run the software is much more expensive than the software itself.
Yes.
I think that's a big, big mistake that this goes beyond B2B. This is all companies, right? But I think especially with B2B commerce, because it's so complex, it's an easy mistake to make, right? Where you just buy a software and then you're like, oh crap, we didn't budget for this.
And what are the solutions, right? I mean, the solutions, and this is, I think, pretty basic, but people don't think about it, is, you have these resources out in the world and you need to bring them in for certain reasons. And, consultants and agencies, or consultants within agencies, if they really have that kind of a practice, become critical for a lot of businesses trying to figure out how to transform. Maybe you're lucky and you have a lot of budget and you have a lot of expertise, and you can just say, all right, we're ready to have our committees meeting and then switch gears and get things done. But that's not usually the case. You usually need to bring someone in, or a team of people in, to help figure this out and to help manage it in an ongoing way, till you get to some stage, or, maybe to the next stage where you have to keep going, right?
Yeah. I also think that the reality, and I think we should bring this up, is that frankly, the companies need to do a better job of understanding that most of these people are incredibly biased, right? And so they go straight to the software vendors. The software vendors are going to tell you whatever they want to get the deal, right? I mean, that's just reality, right? They're going to try and close the deal, but they don't care if the services, they sort of care if the services go well, but at the end of the day, the sales rep's just trying to get the commission, right? Yeah. So they kind of I don't think they truly understand how the risks involved in the people they're talking to, right? And so, you know, you deal with all these software vendors, they're going to be biased. They're also going to bring you service providers that are biased, because the service provider is going to come in and say, oh, well, now I got to sell the software because I got to, you know, stay friends with this software provider that's bringing me all the business. And so I don't think they're really doing enough like objective consulting analysis up front with people that don't necessarily have an agenda. And I think that's a big issue. And then also I think internal teams are biased, right? Internal teams, they're often out for themselves and they want to keep their jobs, and maybe they know something. And so they go with that one thing, but it's not necessarily in the best interest of the company long-term.
Well,
so there's all these like inherent biases that I think also lead to these really bad decisions often. You know?
Oh, yeah. And, you know, you need to have, and, you know, people use different words for this, but you need to have somebody who has a clean perspective, right? Who's somebody who's clean, who's, and that's the not biased, you know, thing, the unbiased part that you're talking about here. They have to come in and say, well, this is what I see based on my expertise. And, you know, I'm not in the pocket of these people, right? They're not, this software company is not paying me to say this, but yes, you made a good decision, or here are reasons that may not be a good decision. Like you gotta have people who you can trust, who can come in and tell you that. And I'll just throw this out there and see what you think of this. But I usually look at this like from three parts. There's the strategy piece where you're brought in like as a, you know, an agency or a consultant, where it's to figure things out, right? That's a piece of it, right? Where it's are we doing this? What do we need to do? How, you know, it's all of that questioning. Then there's a piece that's very distinct that a lot of people will call you in. That's like a de-risking, right? You're basically, a decision has been made because of all sorts of research or reasoning or what have you. And you're brought in to say, but, you know, we want to make sure that it's not going to risk our revenue or our brand positioning or, you know, the types of people that we have internally and their expertise, like whatever, right? And then the third part is a different piece altogether, which is optimizing, right?
Yeah.
A transformation has taken place. And now it's like, well, wait a minute, are we really getting everything we should out of this multi-million-dollar, multi-year investment? Let's talk to the agency and the consultant, right? Those are usually the phases I see.
Yeah. I think the de-risking thing is really important, right? Like there's not enough of that going on, or like, do we even need to do this project, right? Like, do we need to do this project? Are we sure that this is the right platform? Are the people we talking to, you know, objective about whether it's the right tools, right? Like what's their incentive, right? And so I think there's just not enough conversations that are like kind of like looking at different perspectives of, you know, before some of these projects are started. But I agree, there's kind of like this architecture strategy process, right? And I think also not enough efforts put into that, right? There's that upfront analysis, infrastructure, strategy, consulting. I think a lot of people just try and shop around proposals and RFPs, and they're looking for the end result. And the problem with that is like, you're not going to really get a lot of thorough consulting in that, because everyone's just trying to get you the RFP as fast as they can, because, you know, they don't want to spend too much money on the RFP and they're just going to do what the RFP says. But, you know, and so I think more money needs to be put into the actual thought of what and why they're doing what they are. Then there's the transformation, the replatform, you know, phase one, phase two, and then then there's optimization, and they are different phases, right? And then you need different people in those different phases, right? And so
you often do. I mean, you know, like I could come in and say this is what you need, but then I would bring in other people who might be expert in what they need, right? Like, so I think I kind of have this thing at this point where I sort of recognize and I have a process, you know, whatever, right? I have whatever.
Talk about those people, right? So if you're in the, let's call it the discovery, architecture, de-risking, figuring things out phase, who do you think the company needs? And even if they don't, should they hire? Maybe bring in consultants? Like how would you structure that if you were like a, you know, distributor manufacturer, kind of the typical B2B company? In our world, right?
So good question. First thing I would say is that it depends the stage that the company's at, right? So if a company is needs a certain amount of discovery, it could be because they invested in nothing, right? And that actually is easier, believe it or not, than, companies that have invested in things sort of in a random way or not really directionally for over, 3, 5, or 10 years. Because if you haven't invested in anything, there is sort of a best practice at this point. You can go to somebody, an agency or a consultant with an agency, and say, please follow the best practices and launch a B2B e-commerce operation for this, right? And that's actually easier to do than it is to go in and say, well, we launched this and it was kind of working and it's getting 3 million in revenue. And then we have this team here that does this, and we have this digital sales effort that's independent. That's worse. I've seen that more times. And that's almost like you have to bring somebody in to break it apart. Like the expertise.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of misconception in some of these companies, especially like distributors and manufacturers that are like, we kind of want to, I've seen this many times recently where they're like, oh, we want to like kind of improve what we have or build something new, but there's just like no marketing roadmap.
No.
They're just like, oh, we get some phone calls that we're going to funnel to the website. The strategy just isn't there, right? And it's just like, and I agree. I think they'd be better off kind of like saying, hey, Isaiah, we need your help building a plan to like actually make this a real thing that's going to make us money, instead of telling me like, the scope that's probably just going to fail no matter who does the scope. You know what I mean?
Well, it's kind of like you need the business strategy, period. Like, the business strategy needs to be figured out.
It's really funny because I'll give you like a quick story. Like,
sure.
I'm seeing some of those where they're just like, hey, go build this thing, like, and it'll, especially in B2B, where they're like, it's kind of like a B2C, B2B site, kind of like maybe a wholesale site, and they want to like get kind of further down the funnel, right? I'm seeing a lot more of that, and I'm sure you are too. Where it's yeah. Hey, we don't need to only sell to like the top level distributor or the biggest company. Like, how do we serve our, let's call it like $10,000 order or less customers better? It's almost like a B2C site, and we're seeing a lot more of that in B2B. But it's still kind of B2B, right? And they kind of, but they have no marketing strategy. They're just trying to even figure out how to build this thing.
Yep.
And then on the flip side, I just talked to a company that has manufacturing, has distribution, and they just pivoted into B2C. And in 2 years, they're already in the tens of millions of B2C, and they have 5 million followers on social or their platforms in 2 years.
Wow.
So like, it's pretty. I was like, I think I should just go work for this guy. Like, I'm like,
I know. Well, are they hiring? Are they hiring?
But like, the point is like, somehow they figured it out, like incredibly, right? And so, but they obviously had a very smart mindset of having somehow maintaining this manufacturing, distribution, and the B2C business all together. And they understood that they had to build this like massive traffic. And that's sometimes what I tell these folks. I'm like, yeah, we can build you this thing, but if you're kind of going after these smaller customers, it's more of a volume game. And if you don't have a marketing strategy, I mean, you're doomed to fail, in my opinion, right?
You're absolutely right. I mean, and where I think what's interesting is the distinction. There's a distinction in there that our listeners are probably, thinking about, because the distinction is that, sometimes the issues are so large scale. It's like, what is the business strategy, right? What channels are we in? Are we multi-channel, omni-channel? What are we working in? But then the marketing follows almost immediately after that, because like, all right, what is the approach that we're taking in each of these places, and what are our resources? What are our budgets?
It sounds like they really need to have confidence in the ability of having a team that can build manage the project, but also think after, right? How are we going to market it? What's going to come after? Because the ROI comes after it. I think that's what's a lot of missed, is that they just assume, the ROI will just be there, but reality is you need to invest continuously after it goes live.
Well, and this is where our friends at agencies really do come into play, and I want to be open about that. Not everyone needs an agency for everything at all times, right? I mean, even though I have been an agency head, you're an agency head, we've done this. You got to understand what the point is. Like, so if you're if you're a company and you're getting to a certain stage and you do not have the internal expertise, what are you going to do? You should partner with somebody even before you hire, because frankly, I've been in the agency position.
They don't know who to hire, right?
Yeah, exactly. They don't know who to hire. So it's like, are you just going to put out a job description based on some other competitor, change the name on it and say, I'm hiring a person and go? That's not fair to that person. And it's not going to help your business as much as getting the expertise you get from an agency, even for a period of time. Pick 3 years, 5 years, whatever, to figure that piece of the puzzle out. And it can make all the world of difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that building the team is a critical part. And it doesn't have to be all full-time people. There's a lot of people that'll come in and do fractional consulting. We have a good friend that'll do fractional CTO, fractional ecom, VP of ecom.
Yep.
There's a lot of people that'll do that for a period
of time. Me too. That's what I've done. Fractional.
You'll do it, yeah.
Fractional head of market, fractional COO. And this is a great model for people, right? Because you have to also have that mindset as a business that you don't have to pay everybody $250,000 a piece, full time in order to get the job.
Right? Hiring, executives or directors or VPs, is really expensive. Mm-hmm. And, sometimes you really only need their expertise for 3 months or 6 months. And then you can probably move some of the work down to lower level positions that are maybe more cost effective.
I mean, everybody who listens to this podcast knows that I have a little bit of a sense of humor, right? I mean, I try to put everything in a certain light. So I think stories are sometimes more memorable that way, right? But what I say to clients sometimes is, I may be worth millions, but you don't have to pay me that, right? It's like you've got to get the expertise from agencies and individuals in some sort of a combination to make sure that the revenue is going to skyrocket and you're doing all the right things. But you don't have to have all of these teams of people, 40 hours, 60 hours a week.
Yeah, especially in the life cycle of these projects, right? There's a lot of consulting and strategy up front. Once that's figured out, maybe you need less of that, right? After it's figured out, right? And so you probably don't want to hire too much for that full time. Mm-hmm. And then as the project goes, I think the reason agencies work well for that is because, you maybe need a lot of design time up front, or you need a lot of development time in the first, 3 to 6 months. And then, as you go live, you probably don't need as much design time, or you might not even need as much development, right? So the agency kind of scales down as needed. I don't think it's a bad idea for companies to start thinking about building, bigger in-house teams, but I think they have to be really careful about that, because I've seen it go really well, but I've also seen it kind of go sideways where they have all these people, they're really not the top talent. They're not really driving, things forward that well. And they'd probably be better off with one really good person managing an agency, than in some of these cases. So you got to balance that, you got to be careful about how you kind of approach that, I think,
Yeah, and other things, again, I just want to say out loud what I think a lot of people think about when they, hear this stuff. I think the change also, and this is a good thing about what we've learned since the pandemic, if people didn't know this before, is the flexibility is key in this approach, right? Flexibility is key. It's what you just said about, maybe needing to have resources things are design heavy for a while in a project, or dev heavy, or, all of these different things. Not all of that is the same amount at the same time forever, right? You don't have
we actually have an automated report on how many hours we're using and how everything's going with the project and where the hours are going. And it kind of creates a pie graph and shows. So I was looking at it for one of our most recent projects that we just launched. And they needed a lot of strategy up front. So the hours were actually really low in the beginning because, some of it's on them. And then all of a sudden it kind of starts to ramp up, and then it really peaks in the middle of the project, and then obviously starts to go back down at the end of the project, right? So, you don't want to staff full time for that. I can tell you that as an agency, it's very difficult to be staffed for that kind of work. And, as a merchant, it doesn't make sense, because it's going to be so up and down. You're going to run out of work for some of those people when it goes back down.
Yeah, exactly. And the funny, when you bucket all of these things, it's also less scary. Like if you're working on the whole strategic piece, there are internal and external stakeholders. There's consideration about competitors. There's all this data that has to get pulled together. Whatever, right? And you use all of this, to create a great strategic plan. But it's a lot less scary when you have a partner that does this all the time, right? It just makes it much smoother. It makes it much tighter. It also makes it less expensive. I will underline that to everybody. It's less expensive to have a partner that knows what they're doing than to try and figure this all out for yourself.
And especially like things like headless. I mean, we're coming in and I think we're on our third headless rescue, where they're just, they bought or started, and it's just like, had we come in from the beginning, we would have saved them a lot of time and money,
and rescues, that's a largely, not largely, but a big part of, I would say, of what I do, what you do, what agencies do. There are a lot of rescues. People sometimes just get in too deep, or it's too confusing, or something is too new, and they simply say, we don't have that expertise, right? We do not have this. We need somebody who does.
Well, it's a lot cheaper to do it right one time, even if it's a more expensive estimate, than to go with the cheaper estimate, fail, and then have to get the more expensive person to bail it out, or sometimes it even requires starting over.
I'll tell you something that, and again, I have to be so careful about this one, because I really never want to reveal too much about some clients, for good reason, right? Some clients, right? Because this is like a disaster story. So I'll tell you the quick version. The quick version is that the company was trying to figure out all of its revenue streams and its customer base and all the details, because they were trying to get investment, right? And they realized that they had done almost everything wrong. Right. And so when you realize that, it is a huge wake-up call, because there are all these moving parts. I think there were hundreds of employees. I'm not exaggerating that at all. Hundreds of employees, tens of millions of dollars in revenue, yet they're measuring things improperly because they never really invested in like doing all the right analytics, because they went multi-channel fast and whatever.
So they didn't really know what was going on.
So you don't want to catch up on that and then realize you have like 5 years of data to correct, right? You want to do it right so that you can know exactly where you are at a given time, and then get the investment you deserve, or build the revenue you want to get to,
So let's go back to just like the nuts and bolts of the team. I would say I think you need some executive sponsor. I mean, all these companies are going to have some owner executive, right? And I think they need to be, maybe not deeply involved depending on the size of the company, but they need to know what's going on. It needs to tie to their vision and strategy, right? Because a lot of that ties back to the value of the investment. I think some of this ties back to the overall strategy of, I really see kind of like two paths for these B2B companies. It's like, we're either going to move our existing customers online. Look, you can do both. So let me preface that as that it doesn't have to be exactly either or, but I think one of the two of these strategies needs to be the focal point. So we're either going to move our offline ordering online, right? Like, I just talked to a company right now, recently, smaller company, but it's like, he's just taking phone calls, and it's like these little rinky-dink orders, and it's just not efficient, right? And so it's way more efficient for him to kind of bring some of that to B2B e-commerce, right? So I think that's one model, is just making it better for your customers to order. Like, the customers will probably be happier. Maybe you get more orders because they can order off hours, frees up sales reps, like all that value. You kind of have to look at how it helps the company just become more efficient by moving phone calls and emails and whatnot online. That's one model. The other model is the one we were talking about, which is kind of these B2B companies realizing, hey, like, we can start to kind of do B2C, or we can do lighter wholesale, or we can build this channel that brings in all this new revenue that's kind of fairly automated, similar to kind of like Brian Beck's model, where you can bring it onto Amazon, or maybe it's a mix of Amazon and online, and maybe we can bring on a new 5-10 million of revenue. I wouldn't call it purely B2C, but kind of like that light B2C, like light B2B, right? Like maybe it's
Yeah.
the $1,000 orders or I mean, people are placing $1,000 laptop orders. It's not crazy for a business to place $1,000 order online, right? Start to kind of bring some of the and then and to me, that's more of a marketing play. That is a volume-based marketing sales strategy that's quite different than bringing all of your legacy ordering online. And you can do kind of both, but I think generally, like, it makes sense to have at least the first aspect of the digital transformation kind of focused on one of the two, because how you approach those projects is probably going to be quite different, right? And even the platform might be different. The investment's probably going to be different. The ERP integration might be probably more robust on you're probably going to have to do more of an ERP integration on the first version option.
Yeah, you would.
Right?
You definitely would.
Whereas the second one, you could probably get away with something less, or maybe just like tiered price. You know what I mean? And
well, I think what's interesting is that, you brought up a lot. This is great because basically you brought up the kinds of questions you would ask in a discovery, right?
Yeah.
You're going through a discovery and you're saying, well, budget, timing, internal resource, how light, how heavy, because
what's the ROI, right? I mean, what's the end goal, right? Yeah.
And all of this is like, people love the term disruption. All of this is disruptive, right? Everything's disruptive to a different degree, but you really have to know what kind of stomach you have for it, because moving like as you were saying in your example, all customers will start to move online. That's a lot, because you have to think about everything that they already do and everything that they assume and how happy they're going to be or how used to what they're, it's a lot. You have to figure out every angle of this, even if it's like, easy.
So I think that needs to come from the executive, right? Because it's really a big strategy decision, right? And then I think you need some sort of sales and marketing leadership. I mean, ideally you'd have both, but I think if you're smaller, maybe it's kind of like one person.
One or the other, yeah.
Yeah, and then I think you need some technical leadership, right? I mean, someone that's the IT director, the ERP director. Sometimes I find it lives in operations, but someone that's kind of like the technical leader of the company. And then you probably need someone that's like maybe the project manager or the e-commerce manager, or the manager of the project, or the whole thing, right? I mean, I think those need to be different people.
They do. And that last one is most often where an agency or consultant comes in, because a lot of companies I work with, I don't know why it is, or what it is. They don't have a tradition of having project management or program management even separate from.
But I think even if they bring in an agency, they still need someone, because otherwise, who's going to do it on their end? Is it going to be the IT director? Is it going to be the sales guy? And they just aren't usually the best people for that, because they have so much other responsibility. I really do think you need someone kind of like dedicated towards the digital trend, like kind of like an e-com manager kind of role. I mean, whatever you want to call it.
There has to be a point person like that.
I think if that point person, I've seen it be the director of IT, and I've seen it be the kind of the head of sales, but I haven't found it works very well, because they still have to do all of IT. They still have to keep the ERP running. You know what I mean? They still have like this whole other massive responsibility. And I'm not a huge, and I get it. Maybe if you're really small, or, it's a necessity that you just can't afford that next person, then at least being aware that you're missing them, I think, is important. Like, then you have more respect for whoever like the IT director is, or the sales guy that's doing both, right? And trying to get all the sales and manage the project, So I think sometimes companies just throw it on them and just assume it's going to go well. It's like, you're asking a lot for a guy that's probably underpaid at that point,
Yeah. So you need all of those folks internally, and I'm just going to say it, but money's important. Is the top executive who's in charge of this also making the financial decisions, or do you also need the CFO, whoever, right? Because there's that piece that's always behind everything, whether you want to bring it up or not, right? There's always the money piece.
Yeah, and then I think that kind of ties back from the strategy. I think if you're going to do like a kind of a simple, kind of like cheaper kind of go to market for smaller sales in B2B, I think you could get away with like a Shopify site or a BigCommerce site that's, sub $100,000 project. But I think as soon as you start to get into deeper ERP integration, bigger stuff, it's going to quickly balloon over 100 grand with an agency. Potentially way beyond that, right? Depending on what it is. But
well, I'll tell you a real conversation I had, not too long ago that was about that option, right? And basically what folks said is, we want to do it over here and we want it to be its own thing. And when we make enough money, right?
I always hear that. Yeah. When it somehow magically just, creates money out of thin air, prints money.
And I was like, wait a minute.
Let's get into that. So I think that here's this cycle, right? I mean, it usually involves a re-platform or implementing a new platform, or maybe taking what they have and just making it better, some sort of, major structure change, redesign. In some cases, maybe even a full ERP, reset, some back office reset, depending on what's going on there. And so, you're talking probably, a month of strategy at least. It could be 3 months. I've seen it be 6 months, right? Mm-hmm. And you're probably talking another 3 to 6 months, if not sometimes a year of the project.
Yeah.
Talking probably like at best 6 to 12 months, start to finish, like from, okay, we got to do this to I have a new website and B2B and e-commerce infrastructure. And then comes the optimization. And I think that's one of the most neglected, misunderstood. Like that's the difference between the companies that are like amazing and the ones that suck, honestly.
Yep.
They get the optimization. Maybe they have a marketing person. They have people that are spending every month improving what they have. And that's where I think you need either that e-commerce manager, or maybe it's more marketing and an agency. You need a collection of people working together to build this like kind of incremental improvements I think if you look at probably any successful e-com site, they're invested, or B2B e-commerce business is probably, I'm sure they've invested quite a bit in incremental improvements and marketing, right? And all the things on and ongoing after it goes live. Right?
No, this is absolutely true. So when I was mentioning those phases, and we agree on how these things kind of work, that optimization piece is neglected. I totally agree with you on this. And the other thing
underestimated, right? And that's I think it's so underestimated.
It's so underestimated, and this is where I think people realize they didn't invest in the analytics, in how to read,
or even how to understand the analytics, like let alone set it up for you. They don't even know what it means.
They figured they were going to go, get the project moving, accomplish X, right? Whatever the X is. And then it's like, well, now how do we read, what we do?
What's going on?
Revenue,
why aren't sales higher, right? Then they're 6 months in, sales are flat or barely up, and it doesn't make enough money to reinvest into it because there's just no strategy. There's no incremental improvement strategy. There's no roadmap. They're not, tying back what customers want to building those features. There's just, it's just this flat kind of like build it, that is the opposite of build it and they'll come in our industry, right? And it's also probably not going to have this guy that I met who somehow geniusly figured out how to get 5 million followers in 2 years. Like, you're probably not going to have that guy.
you're probably
so that's all. Let's say 99.99% chance you're not going to have that guy. So you're not going to have this like massive organic social channel, especially in most B2B companies. You're going to have to find a way to drive more traffic, drive existing customer, enable existing customers. It's hard. Honestly, a lot of this stuff is just, it's hard to do.
Well, it's hard. And again, this is real. Like the real example that I had in mind was that, people had invested and they see this revenue flowing through, their new platform, let's say. But really what happened was that customers were just moving from one channel to another and they didn't know that, right? Yeah. They didn't know. So they were thinking that they're getting all of this new, but there really weren't sufficient marketing activities that were driving,
the sales are just shifting to the website organically just by having the website, right? And that's really not, there's some good with that, right?
It's good. There are efficiencies and other things that are real positives there, but But that's really where you underline the lesson here. The lesson is you've got to understand how you're reading things, what you're reading, what tools you're using from the start. That's got to be part of your strategy.
I really think you need a 3 to 5 year roadmap, right? What's your 3 to 5 year roadmap? And without that, you're kind of just like, guessing at things and just hoping that this thing will make you more money, right? And so, and it's just not a good way to run the business, and that's why I think some of these bigger companies that are successful with it, they've realized, and they make these massive like they have short-term investments and day-to-day changes, but they also have these bigger, vision projects that they're constantly working towards, and
I think I always like pulling back and then zooming in, right? So pulling back on this, I think what listeners have to do is they have to sit down and have their iced coffee, as I do, and think about this a little bit and say, well, where are we in this picture? Like, what are our needs? What did we miss? Whatever. Start understanding whether they really have that strategy in place if they need it, right? And then you kind of move to the next piece. Once that strategy is in place, like we're getting it done, but how do you read it, right? How do you read this? How do you track it? How do you know if you're successful or not? And then it's really the optimization where, you could bring in a lot of great experts on this. I brought in somebody who's an expert in content, of all sorts into a business recently because, they were doing pretty well, right? But they were thinking like we need to, optimize by audience in particular ways, and we don't have those internal teams and whatever. So it became a question of what do you do?
They created more
once you have all the tools?
personalized experiences. Yeah. And I think that, there's always more, especially in B2B, you can create a lot of personalized experiences. I think someone was on an episode that talked about how they figured out, remember, I think it was the paint example. And the people that were painting their rooms was different, and they wanted an experience that was different from the people that were like industrial painters that are buying like 1,000 cans of paint versus the people buying 2 cans of paint for their room, And so there's endless things you could be doing, right? And tweaking and improving. And and
there's money for all of those, right? I mean, think about it. Every single one of those communities, you could be building, but you have to get all of the other pieces in the puzzle kind of in order. And then that's when you're bringing stuff in to optimize, right? I mean, it could be a goal, but you're not going to have that taken care of like, day one, right? You got to get there,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And you got to pick your priorities. And what do you think from a team perspective needs to change when they go live and they start to get into optimization? Because that's where it seems like things are neglected. It's probably a good amount more marketing heavy, right? Like you need some more marketing, and almost like technical marketing people that can maybe help with managing Google Ads or or like the analytics and things like that, making changes to the website. But what do you think? Like, do you think it's just they just throw it on one guy and it's just kind of like in maintenance mode, and that's kind of why it doesn't?
I think that maintenance mode, that's a great term that you're using, because frankly, that is probably, the issue for a lot of different things where people, things are running, nothing's broken, you're making some money, things are okay, right? And you're seeing benefits of some sort, but that's never good enough. So if it's like the one guy, one gal scenario, that's not good enough. Somebody has to say, okay, like how do we get to the next level? So what I tell businesses sometimes is that, if you had a 3 to 5 year plan and you feel like you've gotten somewhere, what's the next 3 to 5 year plan, right? You constantly have to do this where you say, all right, I don't care what the date is. You could say it's July 1st every year. We have to know what we're thinking for the next 18 months. And are we adjusting that plan, right? There has to be something, and that could mean bringing in more help to figure out what to do in marketing, what's being missed in sales. Is there some tech that we're not taking advantage of, that fully advantage of, that we invested in, whatever, right?
Disconnect between sales and offline and online, and we got to merge those two better. There's all these things, right? There's that sales enablement. I think was it Brian Beck or a few folks on our podcast have talked a lot about that and how important
You can't
sales
sit
enablement
still.
pieces. Yeah.
And sales enablement is critical. I think we've gotten to a really good point, and we've had a number of guests who've said this. We've gotten to the point in the last couple of years where, they are being compensated well because they should be, right?
Yeah.
That's absolutely the right answer. You can't say, no, you don't get e-commerce,
Yeah, you can't
because
have e-commerce compete with the salespeople. It's just a tool for the salespeople, right? And
it makes no sense. And thank
yeah,
goodness people have moved away from it. But there's more, so I think one of the things that I had a client say that was just great was that, they have in their sales meetings, hours they're saying, what else can we do? What can we do? What do you hear out there? What are competitors doing? What aren't we doing? Right. And that's a great way to look at it. What aren't we doing that other people are doing that you think we should? Right.
yeah,
It's a great way to look.
yeah.
And you're not going to do everything, right? You're not going to do everything you hear, but you'll vet it, you'll discuss it, and you add it to your long-term plan. If you stop planning, then I think you're always going to get stuck at some point. You got to keep planning, get that process.
I think that probably a big part of the problem is that a lot of these B2B companies, their teams were built for offline, right? So they have procurement people, they have customer service, sales, they call them inside sales usually, but really they're just kind of like taking orders over the phone.
Yeah.
They have, the warehouse people, maybe the manufacturing people. They maybe have a couple executives who don't have that much experience with e-commerce. And, they usually have a decent sales team, I find. Like that's usually how they got to, wherever they are, is they have some sales organization side to them. And then they have like maybe one marketing guy, but he's not really like a, veteran e-commerce guy. And maybe they bring in an e-com manager, but a lot of times they don't have experience with B2B because there's not a lot of people that do have experience with B2B, right? Versus B2C. At least getting someone with some experience is better than nothing, right? I think it's better to bring on an e-com manager from B2C than someone that has no no e-com experience. So I think that part of it is just like their teams are just, especially that optimization piece, they've really never been structured to do this kind of like optimization, ongoing improvement, marketing.
Well, I'll give everyone free advice. I'm going to give you free advice, listener. The free advice is you can also talk to your own team and say, how can we help you upskill? How can we help you learn new things? Or you say, these are the things we need as we develop the company over the next 18 months. Here's how you can take advantage of this training. A lot of companies do this now, and it's not like you have to go outside to take university classes necessarily, but you can create programs for internal upskilling and retraining. So maybe that person was a B2C e-commerce manager and they were great at that, and you keep upskilling them so that they become the B2B e-commerce expert and they never leave, right? It's all to your advantage as a company to do that. Just do it.
Yeah. I think I would definitely urge, especially these companies that need a lot more knowledge and education. Now that events are back, I would tell them to say, go to all the e-com events, even the B2C ones, build a network in e-commerce. That's a good way, I think, to learn and get immersed in the ecosystem is like, start with the IRC, the shop talks. There's obviously B2B Envision from Mark's thing coming up. There's, if you have Infor.SX, Tug is coming up. We're going to that, it's only for Infor.SX, but a lot of these ERP folks will have ERP events, but they have like an e-commerce, side or a section to the event. Like that's where I would start sending all my folks to that stuff, right? Or as the executive, I would go, right? If I feel like my team doesn't know, I would go as the owner or the executive, That's how that really, at this point for me, I've learned so much, so I don't get as much new knowledge out of them. But like the first, 3 to 5 years, it was really valuable for me,
Well, I won't plug particular conferences here necessarily, but one thing I've done over the years, because, I'm an old timer. I always joke about this, but I'm an old timer. I've done this. So I want to pass on whatever expertise I have and keep getting people involved. So there was a series of web marketing conferences I did up in Vermont where I did intensives, right? Which meant that during the 3-day conference, I was doing like 2-hour workshops, like crash course in digital marketing, crash course in social media, crash course in e-com. Take advantage of those. They're free for people who go to these conferences, and people who are like retailers, or whatever, B2B businesses. A lot of those folks got in free. The agencies had to pay, and all of the vendors had to pay, but not the brands. All right, so get your people into things like that. I spent like 6 hours of my time for free giving this kind of knowledge. This happens every conference, right?
Yeah.
So it's really great. Take advantage of that and do it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and a lot of the events will give you a free ticket, or like they're very eager to get merchants to go. So, if you're a B2B business, you're going to get a much better deal than us. Me and you, right?
Oh yeah, it's absolutely true. And
Yeah.
I was talking to somebody who's an analyst. He's a business intelligence guy, and he takes advantage of stuff online whenever he can't travel, and he does this all the time. He's always looking at like events, and he asks his brand, his company, if they can sign up. He does B2B, and he signs up, and he, on his work time, they say, go ahead, take an hour, right? Because it's to their advantage. He's watching, this particular speaker. They're talking about something directly relevant to his job and to their business. And, it helps everybody in the long run.
I'll plug our event on September 6th. We will be doing a live podcast September 6th.
I can't wait.
So,
I can't wait.
Yeah, we should definitely, hope.
What's it called, Isaiah? And where is it going to be?
Digital Commerce Today and at Laugh Boston. You get a free comedian. It'll be the best ticket deal. Only $200 a ticket compared to everything else in the industry. That's going to be the best.
And by the way, I'm not the free comedian. There's actually a real comedian that's coming into this.
He actually got some awards, and it's not it's not Dave Chappelle, but like he's good. I actually went and saw him personally before we chose him, as they gave us a bunch of options, and he was really good.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's really great. So September 6th, Boston, Digital Commerce Today, and you're right. It's going to be lots of learning. Think of it that way, based on what we were just saying.
Yeah, if you go to Trellis.com, our resources events page, it's the first event there. So, yeah, I mean, I guess let's kind of wrap up and leave people with that, right? Like, it's definitely an education gap, and I think, obviously podcasts, just learning online, but I think going to the events and talking to people in real life is underrated. And COVID's over. Or I guess COVID's over. I don't know. It's like,
I don't know.
Who knows anymore? Everything is just like, but events are back. That's all I can say is after being.
I'm going to say what I've said many times in this podcast. E-commerce didn't exist when I graduated college, and I have been doing it for decades now. So, people got to learn somewhere, right? Yeah. And it wasn't that I was taking classes in this, getting my degree. I was doing other stuff because it didn't exist yet. So I have learned, and I've been of value, and I've been a contributor to this world for a long time. So do it. Go out there and do it.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so much free information, and there's so many people willing to help. Like if you just ask, if you're maybe a less sophisticated merchant, I guarantee you a more sophisticated merchant at these events will tell you everything they're doing, especially if they're not in your industry. They sell, shoes, and you sell, windows. Like they'll tell you everything. They don't care, and you get so much free information,
I totally agree. Just talk with people, take advantage of, free or low cost things like our wonderful Digital Commerce Today, and, listen to our podcast. We've actually been talking about.
We promote the podcast on the podcast. We're marketing
we're marketing the podcast. I mean, but it's totally legit, and I really mean that, because we're trying to be a service to the community for B2B e-commerce. It's really important to us to do that. We're not just here to like shill, right? We're trying to really educate people and be part of the community, and go for it. Listen to us.
Right. I'd like to see it where D2C is, right. And start to get, that B2B experience back to where D2C is. So yeah, let's thanks for the time, Tim. We'll do more of these. I've already thought of some future topics that we will probably want to do on our own. And then I'll say,
ready.
Anyone that's listening that thinks have unique knowledge in B2B commerce, like, we need more guests. So reach out to us.
We do. Reach out anytime. Love to talk to you, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.